This is Qamar Cheema, and today I am honored to have Mr. Michael Kugelman. He's a Deputy Director, Asia Program at Woodrow Wilson Center, Washington. Thank you very much, Michael, for your time.
Thank you. Good to be back here with you.
Thank you. So, Michael, since you are monitoring Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, South Asia a lot, and you are among very few Americans who really understand this region politically, diplomatically, culturally, even as well, and not just the hard side, not just the hard power, but the soft power of the region. You understand. So, my first question to you is that how Americans and how as an independent analyst, you are seeing things in Pakistan, Afghanistan. When the recent reports came that the Taliban stopped Pakistan for installing the fence, and at the same time, Pakistan is advocating Taliban's case globally, trying to enhance their capacity building. For working, helping them for collecting funds, had this wonderful OIC conference where the Muslim world came here. So, but at the same time, there were challenges. So, how do you think that how far this incident has taken you? That do you think this is something very serious, or do you think that this was just something at the tactical level?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me, and thanks for the kind words, perhaps too kind. But yeah, I think that what we're seeing playing out now between Afghanistan and Pakistan is very significant. Clearly, Pakistan itself knew that there were going to be risks of an Afghanistan led by the Taliban, even though I would argue that for Pakistan, it's a Taliban government is preferable to a non-Taliban government, just because it ensures, generally speaking, a friendly government in Kabul, or a government that's friendly to Islamabad. But I think that Pakistan had been concerned about the implications of a Taliban takeover for the threat posed by the Pakistani Taliban. I think that the Pakistani state had been very concerned about that well before it was known that the Taliban would indeed be leading Afghanistan. But I think that where perhaps there had not been as much anticipation in terms of what could happen, it was this new spat between the Taliban and the Afghanistan over the border fencing issue. Now, seen from here in Washington, and to be very blunt, the U.S. government has a very narrowly focused approach to Afghanistan right now. It's withdrawn, and so its policy goals have become much more narrowly focused and modest. The main objective is on the humanitarian crisis. I mean, as you know, there's a lot of churn here, and a very slow-moving process here in Washington to figure out how to bring more assistance to the Afghan people without having the money go through the Taliban government. Beyond that, the other U.S. focus is on ensuring that those any U.S. citizens still in Afghanistan that want to get out, trying to help them get out. And beyond that, it comes down to the issue of counterterrorism. The U.S. government is trying to plan. It's trying to figure out how to develop this so-called over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity, but that's a bit further off in the future. So when it comes to the issue of the border fencing issue, this is not something that the U.S. government is really getting involved in. Though I will say this: we had heard some messaging from U.S. officials in previous months, and specifically from Zalmay Khalilzad, the former U.S. Special Representative to Afghan reconciliation, expressing hope for some type of broader reconciliation between the Afghan and Pakistani governments, recognizing that if you have a better relationship between the Afghan and Pakistani governments, the prospects for more stability and peace in Afghanistan are heightened. So I assume that the U.S. government would much prefer that Islamabad is able to work out these tensions with the Taliban, but at the same time, I think that U.S. officials recognize that Pakistan's relationship with a Taliban government will still be much greater than they would be with any other type of government. And that gets me to the broader issue of what's going on here. My sense is that the Taliban, which has never accepted the Duran line as the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, is acting on genuine sentiment. It genuinely doesn't want Pakistan fencing off the border. But at the same time, I think you could argue that there's some posturing at play here, right? That the Taliban is trying to assert its independence from Pakistan, to try to prove to Afghans that it's not Pakistan's proxy. It is likely playing the nationalism card, the Pashtun nationalism card. It's indicated that it doesn't agree with the idea of quote unquote different of tribes on both sides being separated by this line, so to speak. Those are the words used by the Taliban. So it's a complicated issue. I do think that the tensions will be eased between the two because at the end of the day, as I think you suggested, the Taliban continues to be dependent on Pakistan for economic support and also for diplomatic support. No country other than Pakistan has gone out there into the world and made a bigger case for the need for the world to engage more closely with the Taliban and to deliver assistance to Pakistan. But final word is I think it's important to highlight here that the Taliban may still be dependent on Pakistan, but not as much as it used to because it doesn't need the support it got during the war because there's currently no war going on anymore. And the Taliban will be a bit of a challenge for Pakistan because it wants to assert its independence. It's not going to feel as constrained to defer its frustrations and mistrust of Pakistan. So, the issue of the tensions will remain. And I think that there's links certainly between the border fencing issue and the TTP issue in that sense, because Pakistan is looking to the Taliban to help Pakistan curb the TTP threat. And if you have tensions between Pakistan and the Taliban in Afghanistan, that could complicate those efforts to get Taliban's help in curbing the TTP.
Absolutely right. You have a really fine perspective that obviously the Taliban really want to push back on this. That Afghanistan is no more is not a Pakistan's proxy. Michael, the second question to you is that recently you might have noticed and you have seen in the press that the Iranians have offered India to supply wheat via Tehran to Afghanistan. So there were negotiations between Pakistan and India, but unfortunately, those negotiations could not be successful. So it seems that the Indians want to take the Iranian offer to supply wheat because we have not heard something concrete from the Pakistani government that whether the talks have failed. But it seems that since the Indians have supplied the COVID vaccines to Afghanistan, some 500,000, I think, vaccines to Afghanistan via Tehran, so there is a likely possibility. So, do you think that this is a failure of India and Pakistan for not reaching conclusion? This could have led to something more positive, more concrete in the future. Or do you think that the Iranian influence in Afghanistan will increase? And do you also think that India can use Iran as an opportunity to be in Afghanistan via Iran? And one more thing, I just heard that the Shia lobby in Iran, in India, they're trying to push for more closer ties with Iran. That is also we have heard. So how do you see this Iran, India, Afghanistan situation, or their future trajectory for relations?
Yeah, I think Iran is a very important but often overlooked player in the Afghanistan context for sure. I mean, you look at what it's done over the years. It's maintained a significant relationship with the non-Taliban governments in control between 2001 and 2021, but it also has cultivated ties with the Taliban in recent years, which have included the provision of military support on episodic levels. So it's wanted to hedge its bets, much like another country I know, Pakistan. So looking at Iran's play now, it really is very interesting. I mean, as you know, some years ago, the Indians and the Iranians and the Afghans agreed to an infrastructure project that entails India backing the development of the Chabahar port in southern Iran, which is meant to facilitate trade and transit through Iran up into Afghanistan and further into Central Asia. And it's a project that really has not been able to make much progress, in great part because of the U.S. sanctions regime on Iran, which made it difficult for India to provide financial backing. But all three, well, I should say that pre-Taliban, before the Taliban took over, the Afghan government, along with India and Iran, were both fully committed to that project. And it should be interesting to see how things play out with it now. You know, India has been able to get some waivers from the U.S. government with some of its financial activities with Iran. I'm not sure how receptive the U.S. government would be to that now. But indeed, I think that given India, well, let me put it this way, India, I think, is very keen to remind the Taliban government that India can continue to have leverage in Afghanistan. India, of course, has this track record of providing significant levels of development assistance to the Afghan governments. It was the biggest regional donor in Afghanistan for a number of years. And the conventional wisdom is that India has now been shut out of Afghanistan because the Taliban is now in power. But I think India wants to show that it still has the capacity to deliver the goods, so to speak, and that if there could be, I think that India wants to try to do that with not only a Taliban audience in mind, but also a Pakistani audience in mind. But indeed, there have been delays, as I understand it, in Pakistan providing the essentially signing off on the arrangement that would allow some Indian wheat shipments to go through Pakistan to Afghanistan. And I think we could agree that the India-Pakistan relationship is still in a troubled state, and it would be wrong to assume that Pakistan would anytime soon open up its land, so to speak, for Indian trade transit. And that's what makes the Iran case so much more important, right? India wants to get assistance to Afghanistan. It wants to prove to the Taliban government that it has the ability to be significant, that it has leverage because of the supplies it can provide. And so that means that Iran's importance rises. Now, obviously, it's more circuitous to be sending these supplies into Afghanistan via Iran. Another thing India has been doing is flying in supplies from the Gulf, as I understand it, from the UAE, among other places. But again, that's circuitous. So this definitely makes Iran important. And I think we have to look very carefully at Iran's role in Afghanistan. We've seen, as you know, in recent days, the Taliban foreign minister was in Iran for talks with Iran and also with the anti-Taliban resistance. So Iran appears to want to step to the plate, so to speak. Iran has its own concerns about the Taliban government. It's very concerned about the lack of inclusivity in this Taliban government, and that gets to the Shia issue. Iran really would have liked to see more Shia, more high-level senior Shia representation in this Taliban government. I'm not sure the extent to which Iran mentioned that in the talks. It's not something that the Taliban appears willing to do, but that's a critical factor. And final point I'll make on Iran is Iran has something in Afghanistan that very few other countries have, and that is an asset, right? Iran in recent years has cultivated a militia, a Shia militia in Afghanistan that it has deployed to the Middle East to help serve its interests in Syria, among other places. This is a militia that I don't think is active right now. But if Iran were to conclude down the road that its interests are imperiled, or if Shias in Afghanistan are in danger, one cannot rule out the possibility of Iran reconstituting that militia to try to use it to leverage its interests. But clearly, Iran wants to work with the Taliban to the extent that it can. It wants to help India in its goals to bring assistance to Afghanistan. But it's all very complex given all these different factors I've mentioned.
Obviously, these are really very complex situation. The next point, which I really want to ask, and this question is being raised a lot in Pakistan, and that is obviously the American approach towards Afghanistan. The Pakistani press has been talking since long that the Americans must release some of the money, which is in United States somewhere around $9-10 billion, that so that the lives in Afghanistan could improve, things could be better. The people of Afghanistan need an humanitarian assistance, and this OSCE conference was that purpose. So, do you really think that recently we have seen that there have been some kind of changes about Afghanistan in the American, where some assistance is about to come to Afghanistan? So, do you think that the Americans will release that money before recognition, or do you believe that America will use as a leverage towards Afghanistan?
Well, I don't think the U.S. is going to recognize the Taliban government, quite frankly. And if it does, it's not going to happen anytime soon. The U.S. has been very clear that it's going to be looking to see things on the ground. It's going to be looking for cases of a more inclusive government. It's going to be looking for evidence of more respect for human rights and especially women's rights. These are not things the U.S. is going to see, quite frankly. So I think that means recognition won't happen. And the U.S. has been, I think the U.S., like has recognized that it's still quite substantive Taliban on, even without recognition off the issue about the funding. Uh, any, much less all of those frozen assets. What we've seen, I think the U.S. is trying to do is increase the amount of humanitarian aid it's committed to Afghanistan, and just in recent days, it announced a new pack dollars in humanitarian assistance. It's great, but it's not the needs in Afghanistan, a country where is threatening to collapse. I think that you use those frozen funds. The problem is, as I suggested before, what the U.S. would want to see, the way in which the U.S. would want to use those funds as leverage is not realistic because, as much as the Taliban is looking for financial assistance, it's not going to cease to be the Taliban as we know it simply in order to get access to $9 billion in foreign reserves. The Taliban is not going to change its fundamental positions towards women and towards social policy and the like. It's just not going to happen, to be very frank. And to the extent that you had some voices within the Taliban that had wanted to try to show that they were more moderate, they've been silenced and undermined by the hardliners within the Taliban, who are much more powerful now and hold the top positions in the Taliban government. Certainly, there's a lot of pressure on the U.S., including from many in the United States, from analysts and others, to release some of that funding. But I just don't see that happening. I think that the U.S. hopes to look to third parties, to the UN and UN agencies, to set up new trust funds through which you could have large amounts of money sent to the public sector in Afghanistan, so that doctors and school teachers and other key folks can start to get paid without going through the Taliban. I think that's what the U.S. is focused on. There's also some legal issues that I don't fully understand related to current legal processes going on now in terms of trying to provide compensation to families of victims of the 9/11 attacks. So there's a lot of obstacles, and also I should say finally, from a domestic political standpoint, for the U.S. government to essentially unrelease funds and essentially allow the Taliban government to directly draw on this assistance, that would be perceived in a way, I think, or the Biden administration believes that would be politically costly for the U.S. because it doesn't want to project this idea that the U.S. is essentially going to work with and provide assistance directly to the Taliban government, which is so much more of a brutal entity than so many of the brutal and repressive actors that the U.S. works with in terms of government partners elsewhere. So I think I would be very surprised if those frozen funds are released. So one could certainly make a good argument now's the time to do it, but I just don't think that's where the U.S. government is going.
So we are left with just two more questions. And the second last question I have is that since the Pakistani government decided not to be in the democracy summit of President Biden, and secondly, the relations between both the countries, they have, it seems, not improved. But recently, some congressmen came from the United States. Some Senate staffers came from the United States. They met with the Pakistani authorities, and I was lucky enough to meet, those congressmen. I met also to the chairman mix of the House Foreign Relations Committee, and Mr. Ami Bera as well. And what we heard and what we realized that the impression in the United States is that things are getting very normal between Pakistan and US, but the White House is not taking any decision to call to Prime Minister Imran Khan, and so at tactical level, relations are smooth and going fine, but at the top level, the strategic level, the United States is really annoyed that Pakistan didn't go to the democracy summit. So how do you realize and how do you see such Pakistan's move not to be there? Although Pakistan says we didn't do it for China.
Yeah, I think it was a mistake, quite frankly, for Pakistan to back out of the democracy conference. I can understand why. I think that it was clear that it feared that it was becoming very politicized. And the fact that you had a number of democracies that weren't invited and you had non-democracies that were invited, basically, the perception is that the U.S. invited those countries that can best serve U.S. interests in some ways. And indeed, the fact that Taiwan was invited but China was not, I think that was a big issue for Pakistan, and it would have been risky for its critical relationship with China had it attended a conference where Taiwan was present. I don't think Pakistan has ever done anything like that before. So I think that I can understand why they decided not to, but at the same time, I think this was a gesture from the Biden administration to Pakistan. It was meant to be a confidence-building move, in which to say, well, let's bury the hatchet. There have been some things that haven't gone well. Pakistan wasn't happy to not be invited to the White House Climate Summit last year, but I think the idea was, this is a confidence building move. We'd like you to be here because we think you have an important role to play in this conversation. So for Pakistan to back out was unfortunate. I don't think that it was received well by the administration by any means. But in terms of the relationship's health right now, I think with the relationship with the U.S.-Pakistan one, it's so volatile that whenever there's not a crisis, you should see that as a good thing for the relationship, and that should make you conclude that the relationship is in a good place. And it's true, there's no crisis. There hasn't been a major crisis in the relationship for quite some years, which I guess is a good thing. But I think that there's a fundamental disconnect that will limit the potential for the relationship to really grow, and that's that Pakistan wants to broaden the relationship beyond security, beyond Afghanistan, and the U.S. is still not interested in that. Even though it's withdrawn from Afghanistan, it continues to look at Pakistan through the lens of the Taliban. How could Pakistan be helpful? Is trying to convey U.S. concerns to the Taliban. How can Pakistan be helpful in the U.S. attempt to develop this new over-the-horizon counterterrorism capacity in Afghanistan? Could Pakistan provide intelligence? Could it provide overflight rights to U.S. aircraft and so on? So, and it's an issue of sequencing because the U.S. doesn't rule out the idea of a broader relationship with Pakistan, but it's just not ready for it yet. Whereas Pakistan wants right now the focus to be on a broader relationship focused on non-security issues. There has been high-level engagement. Oftentimes one hears Pakistani critics say, well, look, we haven't had the call between Imran Khan and Biden. Why not? Well, that's true, but I think we may overstate the importance of this non-call, so to speak. There's been so many, you've had the U.S. Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary who have been in close contact with senior officials in Pakistan, including the Pakistani Army Chief. And quite frankly, I would say that whenever there's a call between U.S. officials and the Pakistani Army Chief, that's pretty much the same on the level of importance as a call with the Prime Minister, just because the Army Chief's role is so important in Pakistan. So I think that the call, we've discussed this before, I think, you and I, the call may happen between Biden and Imran Khan, but it won't happen just for the sake of it. The relationship is transactional, and President Biden, I think, will not be willing to have a call with Imran Khan unless there's something to celebrate, some type of achievement, some type of new agreement, perhaps related to counterterrorism cooperation or something like that. He's just not going to have the call for the sake of it. I was struck by how positive the U.S. reaction was to Pakistan's role in hosting the OIC summit. I briefly thought that may have been something that would prompt a call. I was wrong, not for the first time. But let's think maybe a few months down the road there'll be an opportunity for a call. The bottom line is the relationship is in an okay place right now, but I think that structurally it's going to struggle to broaden just because of this core disconnect as to what the relationship should be and what the key priorities should be moving forward.
Okay. So although Pakistan says that we didn't go for this democracy summit because we were asked to send a 3-minute recorded video. So we just didn't like this gesture of the United States. There was no exchange and there was nothing like that. So why shall we go there? But anyhow, coming to the last question, and that is about India and Pakistan. How do you see this India-Pakistan relations moving, sitting in Washington, D.C.? Although when the Indians invite, we don't go. They asked the National Security Advisor to come, we didn't go. They asked the House of Representatives Chairman Senate to go, we didn't go. And now we have heard that the foreign minister was just asking to. It was just a lazy invitation to the Indians that if the Indians don't want to come to the SARC conference, they should not come. They can join via Skype, but they should let others to come. So how do you see, and then the Prime Minister Imran Khan just every other day tweets about Prime Minister Modi on RSS, on Hindutva ideology, and then there is this PM Modi doesn't respond to that and he doesn't say anything. So how do you see this overall, this India-Pakistan relations going in the next 18 months as Prime Minister? And these are the last months of Imran Khan.
Yeah, I think that the India-Pakistan relationship is spinning its wheels. I think that's the best way to describe it. There had been some optimism about a year ago, just under a year ago, when there was a new ceasefire along a renewed ceasefire along the line of control. And some thought that that could be used as a springboard for broader levels of cooperation. But that wasn't meant to be. And I actually think that the goal of the ceasefire between India and Pakistan was very limited. It was simply to reduce violence because the violence had picked up to levels not seen in quite some time. I don't necessarily think there was a goal on either side to use that as a confidence building measure, which is unfortunate. But yeah, looking forward, yeah, I'm not optimistic about the prospects for the relationship. You look at the political calendar in India. Uh, you've got 5 state elections coming up in the next few months, and I think that we know that what we've seen in India is that anti-Pakistan rhetoric plays well politically. So I imagine that there could be some more mudslinging against Pakistan from the government there to fire up the rank and file. That clearly wouldn't set the tone for trying to look to get 2022 off to a good start to try to lower the rhetoric and try to improve the relationship between India and Pakistan. Um, I think that we all know that the new Pakistani national security strategy does call for better relations with India, and it calls for peace with India, and it calls for better trade and all of that, which is encouraging from the Pakistani side. But clearly, there would have to be things that Islamabad would want to see first. I think, particularly in terms of Kashmir, before Pakistan would be fully prepared to engage more closely in dialoguing with India. And this is, I think, is a reflection of what we'd seen from the Pakistani army chief's messaging last year, very similar. But I guess, I mean, if you want to look at conciliatory signs, the fact that Pakistan is now very formally, with this new national security strategy, calling for this orientation away from confrontation with India and more toward geoeconomics, that's a good sign. But we have to look at that as something that's perceived as a far off goal. Pakistan would want to see things happening in terms of India's policy in Kashmir that it's unlikely to see, which means that this whole idea may be a bit of a damp squib, so to speak. Um, but I think that Afghanistan will also be an indication of the trajectory of India-Pakistan relations. If Pakistan continues to limit the opportunities for India to send shipments of supplies into Afghanistan through Pakistan, that's not going to help relations. Um, I think that if India continues to be shut out of Afghanistan and Pakistan continues to wield considerable leverage, that could cause more problems for India-Pakistan. And you look at this more broadly, the U.S.-India relationship is really taking off. And I think one of the big themes in U.S.-India relations this year will be an attempt to execute all of these defense agreements that have been signed by U.S. and India in recent years, which means we could see an increase in U.S. military equipment coming into India, particularly intelligence equipment, technologies. That's clearly something that'll concern Pakistan, and I think could push it closer to China. So, and that's the China factor looms large here as well, right? When we know that the India-China relationship is at one of its worst points in many years, I don't think that's going to change, and that's going to make it all the more difficult for India and Pakistan to try to reconcile to a degree, just because of that China factor.
Hmm. Thank you very much, Michael, for explaining this. How do you see this India-Pakistan relations? And thank you for your overall analysis of how things are developing in the region, particularly Afghanistan, Taliban, and how the American role will be in Afghanistan or in the region. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.